My name is Jim Kumon. I'm the Executive Director of the Incremental Development Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and working nationally to think about small-scale real estate development in a new way and to help build wealth for individuals and communities across this country. Our presentation today is to talk about our time here in Columbus, Georgia, working on the evolving Midtown block by block, lot by lot project. And our organization's mission is to help cultivate 1,000 new small-scale developers in this country and have communities who support their work. It's an integral part that we have both individual actors trying to implement as well as communities working with their regulatory environments, their financial institutions, their government agencies, their nonprofits, and other private sector supporters to make all the pieces of the puzzle work together, the whole ecosystem for creating development opportunities and resources that make the community as a whole more wealthy and sustainable over the long term. We do three things as an organization. We train, we coach, and we connect. We had an opportunity to do all three of these things here in Columbus through the generosity of the Knight Foundation. This project is a part of a Knight Cities Challenge grant. Our work to train and coach is to help balance those ideas of the individual operator who might be involved in a project and the other community institutions and municipal agencies who are part of the ecosystem that those projects take place in. We're here to nurture implementers, and that connect piece was about trying to help build a local as well as regional and national networks of people who are trying to do this work and to be able to compare notes as they move forward in those activities. I want to briefly just describe and show what it is we're talking about. What do we mean by small-scale development? Well, so many development projects over the last 50 to 75 years in our country have been done at a large scale, a master plan scale, an entire shopping center, 20, 30, 50, 100 houses in a subdivision, an office or industrial park. Small-scale development that we're talking about is happening at a different scale, and it harkens back to a different era of development patterns in our country. These are the kinds of buildings that we're talking about, 1 to 3 story buildings that fit into our neighborhoods. And Midtown was an incredible laboratory to test out how these types of buildings fit in because of all of the huge spectrum of development patterns from the early 1900s all the way up through the 1950s that are occurring in the 6 square mile area. And even more so as we began to focus more on the West Midtown area, the area right near downtown, as it also then connected to the areas that were developed in Columbus at the dawn of the interstate highway system. These buildings fit in from the modest tent of someone who's an entrepreneur just starting out, trying to figure out if their business idea is viable to be able to go into a building before they sign a lease, before they take out a loan. Is their business, is their idea viable? And also, the modest multifamily building, right? The duplex, the quadplex. Columbus, and especially this part of Midtown, has the built fabric of our ancestors. These very modest but hugely important, very functional buildings that have stood the test of time, not only creating wealth for the tax base, but providing affordable housing and providing places for new businesses and well-established businesses to thrive. These are the flexible, adaptable buildings that have changed their use over time, even though their form has remained the same. These are the kinds of buildings that our ancestors made, not because they were amazingly smart and intelligent and were doing the newfangled thing, but they did what they saw worked, and they copied and repeated the best parts, and they improved upon them, and they incrementally made that process better moving forward. That's the kind of process we're trying to recreate, put back into place today in order to take the places that were built that way and have them continue to thrive moving forward, teaching to their strengths and working to their opportunities, because they were not built in a master planned way. There's not room to come in and put in a 50,000 square foot building or hundreds of smaller buildings, right? We have these single lots on small blocks to do microsurgery, right, in our neighborhoods, to put all these buildings back into service, the ones that have been run down a little bit, and also to provide new infill opportunities to keep up with the changing demographics and the movement of people in this country that are looking for a variety of both housing and commercial building options. We're constantly evolving and regenerating. Neighborhoods that stay frozen in amber slowly decline. You either change or you change. And the question is it in a positive manner or a negative manner? There's no way to keep a place just frozen in place, right? It will always change and evolve. And the question is, how do we choose to do that? How does the rules that we have and the cultural environment that we have in our community reinforce a positive and wealth-building way for our community? Our tax base, our government depends on it, and the individual decisions and opportunities that we have as families depend on those as well. One of the big problems that we have, not only as we discovered in Columbus, but throughout this country, is that there's not enough people who have the skill set to build those small buildings or renovate those small buildings. There's not enough small developers operating at a small scale who can make small projects work. You can't scale down a large development operation to do a duplex or a quadplex. They're incompatible operating systems. They both are needed. This is not saying that large master plan development is bad or necessary, but it does not fit the built pattern of our neighborhoods that are over 75 years old. And so having, it's like Windows and Mac. If you try to actually start coding something for a Mac and on a Windows computer, it doesn't work because it's not meant for that. It's a software that doesn't fit with that operating system. This kind of work, having small developers, is like having computer programmers who know how to code for the operating system that they're working in. We need to help build a new set of people who understand the places that you have here in Columbus and know how to make them the next incremental step forward better and more prosperous. So that was where we started our work here in Columbus, was to try to find those folks who wanted to do this work, but also understanding what we knew coming in, and we're told by many of you in this room what some of the barriers were to some of the folks who were already out there trying to make that work happen, but were having trouble with getting across the finish line on projects due to various different constraints and challenges. So we wanted to look into those challenges, we wanted to look into those issues and say, can we change those as a community? Can we find the resources and the political will or whatever else necessary to change the way we think about these things and change the rules, but also to train people to work within a system that maybe they're not familiar with or don't know how to work within. And so it's both the individual and the ecosystem both evolving, right, to a new place and a new way of thinking. So again, as I said before, our project is a collaboration funded by the Night Cities Challenge program. We were in the second cycle of the program, following along and working, as it turned out, over the top of a similar area as the project that happened that's also in conjunction with Midtown Inc., as they were the lead, working to reimagine your transportation and active transportation system between downtown, Midtown, and your cultural institutions in the area. As it turned out, the very same places that were identified in that project as being valuable and the public realm that need to be improved was the exact places where there was the most real estate opportunity. And so as we got here, we realized an instantaneous connection between the public realm needed to be improved and the private realm needed to be improved, and they needed each other. They absolutely needed each other. And the work that we've done here has continued to underscore how one needs the other, and we cannot create more private sector value with a public realm that is lacking, and we cannot help justify the public sector investment unless we can create private sector wealth that will help support that tax base. They're absolutely integral. And the Night Cities Challenge program, the program itself was meant to help fund risk takers, people who were going to take risks to try to take on hard issues in the communities. And so we appreciate their forward thinking to invest in us, invest in our community partners. And we want to thank not only Midtown Inc., but also our fiscal agents with the Community Foundation, Chattahoochee Valley. We appreciate their support all the way through to help us be able to put this project together and do what we were able to do with it. So what were we looking for when we got here? Well, we were looking for largely three audiences of people in Columbus to help us work from that individual sector up and from that ecosystem down. Small developers, small investment partners, and small development champions. I'm going to go through each of those three groups. Who are small developers? Well, these bullet points talk about the range of people, largely in the private sector, but sometimes in the nonprofit sector, who are the implementers, people who are also tangentially involved already in the real estate industry, whether it's an architect or a lawyer, contractor, small business owner. All of these folks have vested interest and working daily in issues that relate to your built environment and real estate transactions. Those are the folks we were looking for and continue to look for to give more information to so that their individual businesses and their individual decisions about where to live and opportunities they provide others in the community through their businesses are made possible to look in the small scale direction. We also were looking for small scale investors. Many folks who are the folks doing the development work don't have all the financial net worth or the financial capacity necessary to get loans or to have the proper amount of equity to make the financial transaction part of small development projects work on their own. And so there's always partnerships between someone who's taking the time and attention to put together a great project and the person who can help provide the financial capacity to make that work. And we found so many of these folks, investors, in this community. There's no lack of resources to make these small-scale development projects happen in Columbus. Absolutely no lack of those resources. An incredible, incredible wealth of multi-generational families, especially who are rooted in Columbus, rooted in Midtown, who care about this place and are willing to put their family's multi-generational wealth to work to help the next generation. An incredible thing that we still have really lacked to see in other places in this country where we have worked. The trick was finding the right pairs of people, and the folks who were in this group here in Columbus were all very busy still working on the things that help create that wealth, running their small businesses, working in government, in their government agencies or other different jobs that they had to make this place great. That helps. That unfortunately, though, takes time and attention to continue doing those things that they were doing. So we need to reach out and find more people that we could pair and partner with those individuals to help have the time and attention to do an actual project. We also knew that as this was an effort coming from largely private sector and nonprofit sector leadership, that we had to approach and work with the city government to work on the ecosystem part. As well as county and regional leadership, planning agencies, and others, and as well as other business groups and the chamber organization. All those organizations here in Columbus, especially early on, we were working with to sort of cast the net widely and find folks who wanted to be a part of this process, whether they were in Midtown or outside somewhere else in Muskogee County. I wanted to underscore the appreciation that we have of the senior leadership of the city manager's office of this effort. We got to meet with them very early on, and they understood very quickly the importance of not only Midtown, but places that had the built environment and fabric similar to Midtown, and how critical that was to the tax base. We have an infamous story, those of you who've been around. The first day we came here after we were awarded the grant, we were sitting in council chambers waiting to get a nice pat on the back from city council for winning the grant. We never actually got to witness that ourselves, at least I wasn't there still at that point in time. We were there a good 90 minutes, but I got to see a fascinating presentation about garbage trucks in Columbus, Georgia, and the expensiveness of trying to buy new garbage trucks because of how long the existing ones had been, they'd taken them as far as they could take them. And at the end of that session, the council said, well, we thank you for this, literally it was 45 minutes of garbage trucks that were falling apart in every way you can possibly imagine. And it underscored what they said next, which was to say, Yeah, garbage trucks are kind of expensive, and we need about 45 of them here. You say that's like $10 million ish, and we don't kind of have that money floating around to go out and buy new garbage trucks because we're kind of poor right now, and we're not sure where we'd find that money, right? Which underscored this whole conversation about community wealth. How productive is our tax base? And so that's been sort of the standing joke moving forward was how many garbage trucks could we produce per duplex, right, in Midtown, right? How many more police officers? How many more park programs? How many more things could we do to improve the quality of life in our community with a more robust tax base? And some of the things I will show you towards the end of the presentation talk about not only where, but the kind of place that generates value in communities and what's being demanded of not only in places like Columbus, but across this country. The types of places that are in demand are also the places that are creating the most for the tax base. And so this is something that is the reason why we were brought here, because many of the folks in the private sector who we've worked with were saying, these are the kind of things I'd want to do. I see the value. I see the people who would rent these apartments from me or buy the houses or whatever, but I can't get there. And so I want to underscore again, being able to work with the city manager's office to talk about what was the political framework that we need to work within to begin to bring forth the political and social consciousness about these issues so that they will be able to talk to the council and to the mayor's office to be able to move these issues forward. So again, I appreciate that, their honesty and ability to help put us in touch with people very early on to talk about these issues, and their staff's participation in some of the next activities I'm going to talk about. So we started out with this idea of, well, how are we going to get this done? There's some odds, there's some tough odds here. There are a lot of things not going in the right direction, not only in Columbus, but nationally, trends that are not going in the right direction. Here's the three things that we're going to do to try to, and we worked on doing while we were here to change that, right? To start moving in a different direction. Finding locals who care. That wasn't a problem here in Columbus. Those of you in this room are testament to the number of meetings and time that you spent trying to work this forward, and time that you will continue to spend moving forward on these issues. Also patching and repairing local systems. It was clear early on that we were not going to go rewrite the zoning code of the city of Columbus just to fix this little problem in Midtown we had. We need to zoom in and figure out exactly what we could do to make workarounds and design the path of least resistance around a few things, see if they work. Because we're going to work in that third bullet point, we're going to work in small steps. We're going to take a small bite, see if it works, and before we try to move forward to the next step. We're going to keep moving this forward in small pieces, meeting by meeting, conversation by conversation. So I'm going to get into some of the things that we did that were part of the scope of what we were attempting to do here in Columbus. It was an 18-month process that was largely front-loaded. The first 9 months had a bulk of the more intense activities, and that was done on purpose because the idea was to be able to evaluate the local ecosystem, find and recruit people, and train them, give them enough information to see if they want to be involved in this process, and get that part done as soon as possible, because we knew that if we were going to have to change city regulation, that was going to take some time. We needed a lot of time at the back end of the process to deal with things that we couldn't predict to know how they were going to happen. So this process was front-loaded in that way so that we knew basically what was going to happen the first 9 months and had no idea what would happen the second 9 months. And so I'll be able to tell today, now that we went through the 9 months plus, and see where we came out, where we stand today, and the work that's left to be done here in the community moving forward. This is your incredible value-generating public realm, right, near Uptown, right next to you. This is the community that you have continued to reinvest in. The resurgence of the core of your city has helped fuel value creation possibilities in your near neighborhoods. What we're doing here in Midtown would have never had any traction whatsoever culturally and through the processes that we're trying to do if not for the work being done in your core downtown on Broadway, right? That resurgence is, as we were talking to people in your community, changed the way people thought about old buildings and businesses and the usefulness of walkable places, right? It proved that that model was not dead in this city and this part of the world. And so for us to be able to say, hey, wouldn't it be great that you didn't have to actually get in your car and go all the way downtown to find the 8 good restaurants in your community? Wouldn't it be great that if every neighborhood in your city actually had similar types of quality of life aspects, not only restaurants and businesses, but general everyday services? Wouldn't it be great if every place, every neighborhood in your community had the vitality, a sliver of vitality that your up and coming city core has, right? And people would nod their heads. They're like, oh yeah, I would love to not, I've been to all 8 great restaurants, and I'd love if there were a 9th and 10th, but I don't know where they would go because we've kind of filled up all the storefronts now, right, on Broadway. And I love walking there, and I love the farmer's market, and I love all those things. And say, well, you love your neighborhood too. What's stopping us from that happening again? This is one of our favorite, my and my colleagues' favorite images of this place because it was a snapshot of the way this community had thought of itself for a long time, and still does to a certain extent, but was different from the way that we would look at your community or think about your community. This is going to be a little bit wonky for the urbanist crowd. Of thinking about how do we think sort of abstractly about a place? How does a neighborhood? We're really concerned about the neighborhood scale. That's really where we want to work at. What we saw here was a collection of places that all had an incredible identity, right? For all kinds of different reasons, whether it was the buildings or the people or some combination of both, right? History and culture combined to create a sense of identity in all these names, these places. What we didn't see, though, and what we couldn't quite understand by looking at this map until we were able to be on the ground and sort of compare those boundaries with what the physical environment told us were the boundaries. And so we made this very, very wonky map that looked at the idea of what were places, what were neighborhood places. This idea of if you stood at this corner at the Village on 13th and walked 5 or 10 minutes, so each one of those circles is essentially a 5-minute and then a 10-minute walk away, what would you see? What could you access? If you were a resident, if you were someone working in a business, what are the things that were within reach for you? What were a short drive, a bike ride, a walk away? And thinking of a neighborhood as what it should be, a collection of resources of housing and businesses and community resources like parks. And so we tried to look at and sort of try to see to the past. How did these places used to function? Where were the buildings where those services used to be 50 years ago? How did those places work? Up in East Highlands, right down here, Radcliffe area. Obviously the changing nature of Winton and Macon Road over the last 50 years, when there used to be on-street parking on Winton Road and what it was like then when there was, and then what it's like since there hasn't been. Same thing for 13th Street. Saw the photos of the day that they removed the parking, right? These are sort of cultural markers of this community, and we can look and see before and after and say, what's different about this place now? How did these changes to the physical environment affect the way that we interact with the environment? So we try to look at this as an abstract drawing to say, okay, these seem to be centers of gravity, historically as well as still relevant today. How do we re-envision how that fine-grained network, I love this map because it shows you how fine a grain, right? These 25-foot and 37-foot lots, right, in your community, and then the areas that were built a little bit bigger lots, right? You have, something as large and as important as Aflac Tower, right? And you have this amazing cluster of industrial and heavy commercial buildings that are the heart of your tax base. I know this because I've seen the tax bills that they pay, right? These are all crucially important. The ability to, as I know, people who live and work south of here and be able to work in those areas, right? Not just retail jobs, but other good paying jobs for this local economy. These things are all still in place. When we started walking around this community talking to people, your neighborhood economy in this area worked really well. It just seemed that no one knew about it, right? If you weren't in this spot, you were over here, or you worked down the road, at the highway, you didn't know what was happening over here. That's what we found in this community. There was a lack of understanding of what was happening in these places that had been productive for a very long time. And so it's like, why? Why does no one know about the great stuff, right, It's happening in this incredible industrial building here at John Anker's facility, right? Why doesn't anyone know, what's going on, or why is there only one place to get coffee? A colleague and I spent about a half an hour driving around. We'd been to Midtown Coffee, and we're like, oh, it's a great cup of coffee. Let's go find, we've been here, a couple days. Like, let's go find another coffee place. Let's go check it out. Let's just see what's here in Columbus. And then we drove, and we drove, and we drove, and we ended back up at Midtown Coffee, right? And then eventually we found Iron Bank downtown, and we're like, well, we didn't want to, we were going to downtown that evening. Like, well, we'll save that for later. So those basic pieces of the puzzle, right, we're missing. Why? There's way too many people of way too many across an entire economic spectrum for there to only be one coffee place, right? Besides all the gas stations on Winton Road, which we were a little suspect about their coffee, right? Think about, you all know this map. You know who lives in all these places. Some of you live on this map, right? Think about we have the entire spread of your community's economic spectrum right here, right? How is it that those pieces aren't working together, or they're perceived, and I want to underscore this, perceived to not be working together? As we worked here more and more and more, we realized this was not about reality. It was about the perception of certain parts of your community not being able to be as productive as they actually were. And so I think in the end, one of the things that we were able to help do here as folks from out of town is to say, look, you're sitting on an incredible set of opportunities here, but it's hard to see that when you've been here day in, day out for many of you, a very long time. We wanted to bring a new light to the value that was here and to what was possible. Well, we heard that this thing was happening too. This is another one of these wonky things called a tax allocation district. So if you don't spend a lot of time reading city hall minutes or checking out government finance tools, this is a way for government agencies to be able to utilize real estate development and other transactions to raise money for infrastructure and other community programs. Tax allocation district, the way it works is development happens, and the increased tax revenue from that new development or the rehabilitation of a building, there's a difference between what they're paying in taxes before and after. And that difference can be captured to be put into a special fund to reinvest in that geographic area. So wherever the project is, there's a boundary, and all the projects in that boundary contribute to a pool of money that will be then spent inside that boundary, right? So all the hard work that's being done will be spent in the same place where that hard work was accomplished. Because hopefully you spend that money in a wise manner, that district will become more attractive. It will hopefully attract additional activity, and that positive cycle continues, and the redevelopment process goes on. There's a timeline to this, 20 years, but hopefully at the end of 20 years, through incremental processes, the place will be much improved at the end. This was just happening when we got here. The final boundaries were being established, and there's one key part, though, that is assumed in the process of the tax allocation district. That first thing at the top, development happening. It's the given, except when it's not, right? So we started walking around Midtown trying to understand this place, understand the development that was happening, to understand the buildings that were there, understand what the zoning was going on, where there were issues with stormwater. And so what did we find in this initial scan? This was in the first phase of the project where we were gathering information and organizing it. We first did a local building survey. There's about 2,000 images actually that we're going to organize a few more of. And the goal of this, and I had a good friend of ours of the organization come down. He does this throughout the country. He has an amazing eye and amazing ability to talk to people on the street. And we set him out for 3 days. And it was really hot. It was June. he was at 90-degree heat. But we sent him out because I heard it's kind of hot here most of the time, not in January apparently. But and so to send him out in the middle of June is sort of like, that's par. It's a normal time for that everyone in this community has to be traversing this community, right? And so to look at what was there at face value, right? And remind ourselves, especially for those of you here locally, this is the cross-section of our community. Here's where we stand. Here's our baseline, right? That tax allocation district says we got to go from here to here. Well, in order to know where that change is going to be, we got to know where we stand today. And sometimes, like in the picture of this building, Sometimes we don't want to remember certain parts of our community, right? Because it's not what we hope it to be. But it doesn't mean that this is a perfectly productive building actually in your community. But again, that perception that because of the way it looks, that it's not, that somehow that because the paint's stripping off, that the tax bill isn't very high, that's actually not true. Because of your tax structure in this community, all of your commercial buildings and many of your multifamily buildings are paying a huge percentage of your overall tax base, right? Even buildings that look like this are paying a pretty serious tax bill, right? That's the reality. Those are the facts. So we want to look at what's there, and then you have buildings like this, just these gems here in Wildwood Lane, right? We would just walk by this building. We were feeling a little bit frustrated throughout the project. We walk down the street here, because it's just down the street from where we're at today, and look at this gorgeous building left by your ancestors, right? A building that's productive, providing housing, right? That's been productive. So this is one of the most productive buildings in all of Midtown, right? This stately but still a modest 20-unit building, which happens to be illegal on the lot it's built on today. But if you tried to rebuild this again, you couldn't do it. You'd have to build about 4 units less because the zoning says so. So to link productivity of a place like this, and also to look at the places that need more love like this, right? Especially on the small lots in East Highlands and East Winton, right? The places where some of the folks who have the least in this community are also still making a go at it, right? Crazy enough, these places, even the ones that need a lot of love, also are incredibly financially productive for your community because there's so many of them on a block, right? For the same, many of these cases, there's 9, 10, 25-foot wide lots on a block. Incredibly productive, even though some of these houses are only worth $25,000 to $50,000, right? If they were on lots that are the size of a single-family house elsewhere in the community, there's 4 of them, 5 of them, in some cases, right? So you add them all up, they actually are worth the same worth as a building on a larger lot elsewhere in your community, right? People hadn't thought through that math. Well, if I have 4 $50,000 houses on the same lot, the same amount of land as one house worth $200,000, at the very worst, it's equal, right? These are the realities that we found here in the community. We got to list as Assistant Deputy City Manager Pam Hodge. Sitting down with us, she, as many of you know, was the former financial officer of the city. She loves talking about your tax base, as it turns out. Really likes it a lot. And was stunned, and this is a picture of here, working with at one of our activities with city staff and community leaders, sitting down together, trying to understand how small-scale development worked and what kind of value that those projects created. And there she is with her cell phone, calculator out, working through. She said, this can't be right. How could this, there's no way. I mean, these rents are so modest and the return is so terrible. Why doesn't this real estate transaction work? And so that was the next stage of our process here, meeting with local entrepreneurs, people who are trying to make things happen, trying to find places to put their businesses, trying to find places. They were looking in a certain part of town, couldn't find the kind of real estate in that area of town. And we're saying, well, I would love to be in a building. I would love to take one of those buildings I just showed you a few slides ago that needs some love, needs some work, needs a new tenant. I'd love to be that tenant. Unfortunately, the use table in the zoning code says I'm not the right tenant for that building, right? I gotta go get a variance. I gotta go get a special exception. I gotta do whatever. This is what we heard from your local entrepreneurs. We also provide a little bit of education. This is my good colleague Joe Micosi, others like John Anderson, Monty Anderson. We had a lecture series in conjunction with SOAR Columbus with their Preservation for Profit event back in August 2016 to help talk about these issues after we went out and looked at everything we could see in your community. Say, hey, here's where we think we're at, right? We're folks from out of town. You tell us more about your place, right? But this is what we see with our own eyes. And here are things that are happening from around the country, trends, changes, things that are happening in Atlanta, things that are happening in Macon, things that are happening in Chattanooga that might be happening here or could be found here. Are we talking about this here in Columbus yet? Those activities also bled into something we called the Development Implementation Charrette, where we actually dug in and tried to figure out where we were at today. If someone tries to do a real estate project with the rules the available financing, the marketplace. Where do we stand? Let's find out. If we're not seeing the kind of development in the community that the community wants to see, let's find out why by trying it out, by actually doing it. And so we were able to sit down with community leaders, folks in the city, many of you here, to give this a try. We worked with 6 groups, and we assigned different groups, different size lots, different zoning categories, and we just gave it a go. And that was the nucleus for discoveries like this, right? We have a whole bunch of lots that are 37 feet wide that we can't figure out how to build something on legally, which is kind of interesting. And this was one that just completely blew Ms. Hodge away, as we explained to her that this modest single-family house that was not even about 22, 24 feet wide on a 37-foot lot, and actually this one's actually a duplex, that this 1,000-square-foot building could yield more per acre in tax productivity than the local Walmart. Right? How is that possible? Right? It was the way that this community has used its land. And the power of small-scale development is potency. Joe Minicozy spoke about the potency of your land development and how you should look at what is producing the most for your tax base and make more of that. Right? If a farmer is growing several crops and selling them at the market, and it takes the same amount of effort to grow all 3 crops, and they can sell one crop for twice as much as the other 2, what should they do, right? So examples like this showed modest buildings that fit on lots that nobody could figure out what to do with and were laying fallow in your community could become productive again, but for not some of these rules. And so some of the roadblocks that we found and we're able to then clearly identify and characterize, particularly with the zoning code in the community. But we also found things like extremely low commercial rents. As it turned out, Winton Road and places nearby in the 1950s were the heyday of the commercial, of the whole community, not just in the neighborhood, but the whole community. As those regional centers of economic and retail moved elsewhere in the community, that those buildings that were formerly housing those services were left behind and fell into less productive uses. Important still uses in many cases, but not as financially productive, and to the point that many of them became vacant. And the amount of vacancy going on, I think we ended up calculating on 13th Street in that 5-block area between the Aqueduct and the Village on 13th, we had something like 67% vacancy, right? No building that has a long-term lack of tenant is going to be as financially productive as one that has a paying tenant, right? Especially from a commercial perspective. So a widespread lack of vacancy, pressing down commercial rents, parking burdens that made projects not ever get going because there wasn't enough land to somehow meet parking requirements, even though there are businesses just like the business trying to open just down the street, operating with much less parking for a much longer period of time. How are those things equal? How does this make sense? Does the amount of parking match the character of our community, right? Where that parking goes? The zoning in many cases left all kinds of smaller size lots, especially those under a half acre in size, just not able to do much of anything that made any sense. And multi-unit development had largely been left out of practically everywhere in the community except for a couple of concentrated spots, right? Which was unfortunate considering the amount of commercial property, commercially zoned property, where you're not allowed to build any residential units, right? So all these 4 things were the top 4 things that we saw that individually and collectively were oppressing the amount of ability to do small-scale development in the community. So we started, after doing this initial phase of inquiry and education, to organize and to do, as we entered our second phase, which was our training phase. And through tools like the website created and hosted on the Midtown platform, talking about events, creating opportunities to hear more and learn more about how to actually start doing something about this. What we heard at the end of that first phase of information gathering and sharing was that this wasn't good enough for your community. Many of you in this room and many people who came to these events said, we can do better. We know how to do better. Our businesses, our families' futures depend on us doing better. us repairing long-term disinvestment and cultural relation issues in the community depend on us doing better. It was clear. It was clear that the leadership from the city to the nonprofit sector, to the private sector especially, said this wasn't good enough. And there didn't seem to be any really compelling reason why the things that were the roadblocks that were identified needed to stay, right? Maybe they made sense 20 or 50 years ago, but there wasn't any compelling reason why the rules were the way they were. And so the good thing about rules and laws is that people can change them and communities can change their rules. And so we began to go down a path of, okay, how will we do that? Where can we find best practices from other places thinking about that? The one-day workshop that we hosted in November of 2016 was for everyone in the community, not just people who wanted to become small developers, but everybody who had a stake in your ecosystem for small-scale development. And we had a great range of folks from both city management, planning, and zoning, as well as a cross-section of nonprofit organizations in your community, as well as many people who were interested, property owners, business owners, in trying to do something with their properties, especially those who were obviously underproductive, right, and underutilized. And so this one-day workshop allowed us to kind of put out there a new operating system, especially around these small-scale lots. And we began at that point in time to begin to zoom in more on West Midtown. And this is a cross-section of people, who were there at the event. And these are the kind of things we talked about. We talked about how to formulate a project, right? Financing tools, site planning, performas. We talked about how to think about financing in the same conjunction as design and the kind of buildings you're doing. Don't try to build a building that's more expensive than the ones that you can afford based on where your marketplace is at. We talked about this idea of being able to harness the 30-year mortgage to build modest 1 to 4 unit housing, right? Attached, detached. Looked at wonky code rule stuff about how to build mixed-use buildings and how to comply with all the different rule sets that are a part of that equation. By adding 1 unit on the ground floor of a mixed-use building, avoided the necessity to have a $75,000 to $100,000 expenditure for an elevator in that modest 2 to 3 story building. Why does that matter? Think about $100,000 less of project costs, and a project is probably no more than about $1 million. Think about how much less in rent 12 people who might rent a unit in that building will have to pay, right? Some buildings need elevators, some buildings people can pay for those. But because we're trying to provide a wide range of housing opportunity, being able to meet a price point in your community requires creativity and attention to detail in these technical issues. This is a financial performa. This is one we filled out. And in 1 page, you can figure out whether a real estate transaction works in your community and what needs to be improved if it doesn't. And this is sort of how it all wraps into. And this is a transition point to our next training course, which was specifically for people who wanted to do a project. This wasn't a financial investment package. This is a sample of what you need to have in order to go seek investors or to seek financing from a bank. And so making these projects work on paper, here's an example, another example of the kind of work that we did both at the implementation charrette as well as during a 2-day boot camp of actually taking these little paper cutouts to scale and putting them on paper, figuring out what worked on a modest lot. That's a 100-foot wide lot, right? It's that simple. These things are that easy for people to wrap their heads around because it's not so huge, right? Everybody lives in a lot that's not too much bigger than that, too much smaller than that. So then we had our boot camp the following February, 2017. And that 2-day event, there's a few of you in this room actually on these sheets. This is our directory of folks who joined us for that weekend. We had about 25 folks, both from here in Columbus and throughout Georgia, who came with their properties, who came with their ideas for the kind of projects that they wanted to see happen in their community, many of which were not happening anywhere in the community. And we sat down and worked through a project, through a phased set of lectures and then work time. We had several more faculty from our team at IncDev to come in and work with people one-on-one, wherever they were at in the process, whether they owned a piece of property, whether they were in the middle of a project they were trying to make better, and we worked through a project, right? This photo is actually the extruded version. They started to draft out This is about a 12 to 15 page document, which is that investment package I was just talking about. Here's every page in that package. They set them all out on a table, and that's Monty helping them rearrange and cross out and redline and edit that package, right there at the event. This is that new way of thinking, right, at the small scale, putting together a package that's in many cases more impressive than the packages that produce much, much less value, right? The people who come to our classes who already have experience in the real estate industry often tell us, well, I knew about this, but you help us organize this information in a more professional way, right? We wanted folks who were newbies who'd never done this before to start with that expectation and start with that knowledge. So what could we do to take action? After we went through this training phase, one thing was very, very clear. After many, many, many simulations on paper, working out those projects on paper, we found a whole lot of projects that didn't make any sense at all. And one of the main reasons it didn't make any sense was due to the zoning code. There were not just one or two little things that were holding back development, but a whole host of issues, which individually by themselves could probably kill a project, and together were a cloud that you could just not run away from. So for the number of people who wanted to do a project, no one in good faith could move forward on one because there was just too much risk involved trying to figure out how to work through all of those different regulatory issues. And so we went forward, and like I said, these are the 4 ones that we were trying to work on and figuring out what could we do. So we zoomed in further. We said, well, we can't fix zoning for the entire city. We can't even fix zoning for all of Midtown. There's too many different conditions, too many different issues. But let's look really closely at this one area, particularly this area that also has this tax allocation district that seemingly wants to have more development. We should start there, right? This entire community agreed that more development in West Midtown was something that everybody agreed for. Okay, well, let's make the development happen because we know why it's not happening now. And so the idea of a zoning overlay came about that would allow these 4 things at minimum. Allow multi-unit buildings on small lots, and by small I mean 50-foot wide lots, which were largely only zoned for single-family buildings, whether in name or in actual practice. There was many multifamily lots of this size and smaller, which were zoned multifamily. And yet, when you actually tried to put a multifamily building on that lot, what did you get? No more than a single-family building, right? All the parameters basically knocked you back to the point where only a single-family building would work or be allowed. We also said, well, there is a lot of commercially zoned property in this tax allocation district especially, and it has horrible rents. And it turned out that residential rents were as much as 50% more per square foot than a commercial rent. And so that probably means that there was not going to be enough commercial usage to put all of that square footage back into productive use. And there is a huge housing need in this community. So we said, well, why don't we give it a try to let somebody try to do something with some of those lots and see what happens? Because we've been trying this other way for about 25 years and aren't getting too far, right? So what's the worst that could happen if somebody wanted to take a beat up old commercial building and put an artist loft in it, right? How terrible would that be? Well, we don't know because it's not allowed for anyone to try. Parking buffers, setbacks, and other things that were actually counterproductive to the character of this place, right? This entire neighborhood we stand in today here in Midtown was built before zoning codes, right? The codes we have today actually create conditions and create buildings and create the relationship between buildings in a way that's actually much different than the built environment that we have from 100 years ago, which didn't make sense. It caused people, when they saw projects, to say, no, you can't build that building. I will not. I will stand here with a pitchfork and make till you go away. And the poor developer, whoever they were, just said, I'm just following your rules. Right? I put the building exactly where it told me to go. Right? So if we don't like the buildings we're seeing over and over and over again, we should change the way we're directing people to put stuff on the ground. And finally, in many cases, you can see that through either the written intent or the name of the zone, that there was an intention for something to be happening. And through a collection of competing factors and competing variables, that wasn't allowed. Like I said, a multifamily lot, which you could only put a single family unit on, right? I mean, even if you could get 2, that would be multi, right? It wouldn't be much needed. And so trying to allow the intention of whatever the rules would be to actually be allowed in real life. So this was a map created by Urban 3, who did a study here. I talked about Joe Minicosi's work earlier on. And this is a quick snapshot, and we love when we have the ability to use their work ahead of ours. Green is actually low value per acre. It's this idea of how potent your real estate values are. And so you can see, obviously, something like the Aflac Tower, very potent, right? A tall building in a small lot, really potent. But look and see where there's other, potent places. And you can see that the areas by which, this is like, this is CBT, this is the bank building. You can see where there are places that are not very productive. And it turns out they also overlap most of the lots that were put in the tax allocation district, which is to say there's a lot of room to improve, okay? And so this proposed overlay also was thinking about including, and this is a conversation that's happening currently actively right now. These are suggestions that we made based on the fact that there are 2 existing redevelopment districts in East Winton and East Highlands, and this tax allocation district would happen to neatly connect the 2 of them. These are places that there's long-standing city policy to say we should have better productivity and more redevelopment. Well, let's change the rules then to make that happen. So when you look at the city code and go to the city website today, you can see the general guidance, right? This is what should happen in the residential office zone in our community. And these are the buildings that we are going to assume as examples that would actually be allowed by this table of rules, except that it's not. We went to some of these buildings. We actually know where that one's at. We actually looked at the rules. First of all, that building is not in this zone, first of all. Second of all, if you actually try to take the lot of the sizes of these buildings that you found here, or any of those that are suggested above, these don't actually produce that result. All right? So at that point we said, okay, well, yeah, these are general guidance. This was sort of, this is just someone trying to help people look at the intent. So what we actually decided to do is draw what your code says, so that everybody can understand the general parameters of what is possible by right in your code today, and look at the character of your community and say, does this look like what you have or what you want? I can't make that value judgment for your community, but I can tell you from what I heard listening to so many of you were not aware that this would be possible or allowable without any other input, because if you tried to stop someone from building that building on a 100-foot wide lot that was zoned RO, and you sued them and say, oh, no, you can't do this. The city says, sue them, city, right? They can't do this. They would lose because it's totally allowable by your rules today. And so we have a whole other presentation to talk about the nitty-gritty details of how these things might work, suggestions we are making that need to be calibrated and vetted by all of you in this community. This was another one, going back to that cottage I showed you earlier, which was on the same size lot, 37-foot wide lot. What was allowable today under your multifamily zone, which is for duplexes? Nothing, because of a minimum lot size requirement, a minimum lot width requirement, and also the density requirements, barely allowed 2 as it was, even though that's the definition of the zone, okay? And so we said, wouldn't it be swell to build something on those lots as opposed to nothing on those lots that you have maybe dozens, if not hundreds of vacant in the city? We also looked at trying to calibrate something that made sense. As we were big proponents of being able to use those 30-year mortgages to build wealth for families, especially as owner-occupants, we said, hey, you know what? Would it be terrible if every lot that was zoned in multifamily would be allowed to have a 1 to 4 unit building? Right? Is that a reasonable thing to ask a small lot to do? Right? Be able to have up to 4 units on it? So let's change the rules. Let's tinker. So up and above here, what we did, and there's a package we'll have available on the website that shows the current zoning in white and some tweaks to those numbers, right? Instead of an 8-foot setback, a 5-foot setback. Instead of 14 units to the acre, 28 units to the acre. Now, whoa, hang on, we're going to double the density? Yes, if you go from 1 unit allowed in a multifamily zone to 2 units, you are doubling the density. But you're actually also trying to be more in character with your community than less, right? So we were trying to go through, and I'm not going to explain all of these pictures, but this is a great thought process of, over the same parking requirements, you could have a 6-unit building of oversized units that would be hard to rent, or 12 that would be right-sized. Guess which one's legal today, right? This is what's possible in your commercial zones, a commercial building. as opposed to a set of small buildings of 50 or 25 or connections of those buildings thereof, which is much similar to more like the built environment you already have, right? And this is if Darth Vader, the developer, struck and decided and had more money than sense and could build a 4.5-story flash cube office building. And there's parking underneath the building, by the way, because in order to meet the parking requirements, basically we took this acre-sized lot and said, how many parking spaces can we fit? Because as it turns out, in the general commercial zone, the number of parking spaces governs how big a building you can build. So we had to basically cover the entire building with parking, elevate a large building at a significant cost, and build as many square feet as we had parking spaces at 4 per 1,000 square feet. Right? If this is not the outcome you want to see in Columbus, Georgia, you have the power to change these rules, and you have the power to change these in neighborhoods that don't look anything like this. Right? There's no buildings that look like this in these zones in the West Midtown. So this is the wonky table that if you made all the changes, what it would look like. You can take a look at that in the packet we have. But in short, as we move forward, it's clear, as we talked at the beginning and now at the end, that the big developers, the large developers that we were always thinking are going to come from Atlanta or from New Orleans or from someplace else and to come do this work for us, they're not coming. Right? And they're certainly not coming to do a 100-foot lot in West Midtown. Right? Not their business model, not the place they care about. And so we continue to be and are glad to have been able to go through this process with these. This is our boot camp alumni. These are the 25 folks working on projects for this community and others nearby here in Georgia who want to be that person who will stand in that gap to build those buildings here in your community today. And it is a group that can continue to grow, and is the group of people that will hopefully continue to work with many of you in the community, in the ecosystem part, to change the rules to allow the community that you want to see happen. So again, I wanted to thank our partners in this project. While we are closing, the money has run out. The effort and the thought process lives on in all of you, right? And as I've been told by many of you here personally, individually, that even though we didn't get a chance to build all these great buildings yet in the span of 18 or 20 months, we've changed the mindset about how people think about real estate. And I believe that's happened, and I'm committed to continuously be at service to all of you in this community because this is about planting seeds. We knew when we got here there would be a long way to go to change the mindset about how real estate development could happen, especially in this core part of Columbus. And so we are here for the long run. You don't get to be called the Incremental Development Alliance and expect things to happen overnight, right? So while we may not be back as frequently, we are doing a lot of work here in the Southeast, and we are always at service for anything that you guys need in this community. You are a huge part of who we are as an organization today. The work that has happened here, and this again is a shout out to both our local partners and our national sponsor, the work that has happened here that we've now been doing in other places, we learned for the first time here, has now been replicated in Memphis, in Albuquerque, right down the street here where I came from yesterday in Atlanta, Georgia, right? They're learning from me in West Atlanta, right? My client's the city. They're learning from things that we figured out here first in Columbus. So I hope that you'll all be able to continue to learn from them. We're putting together a little group here of people up in Atlanta here this spring to continue to share this information, both for people who want to do projects as well as folks who continue working on the ecosystem. And we appreciate this opportunity to have worked here and be a part of your community for the last almost 2 years. And so thank you so much for all of your help and time, and we look forward to continuing to watch how you evolve Midtown and Columbus for years to come. Thank you.